Hello, my name is John, and a few people have asked me if I could possibly do a couple of videos to show people how I paint scenery, how I do conversions, how I do some green stuffing. So I thought what I would do is I'd do something really simple. So I've taken some of the Warcry scenery, the Mausoleum set, and to keep everything very basic, very simple, I've just taken 10 different paints to do this with, and I only spent the most part of 2 days. Not very long at all. So it's nice and quick, nice and simple. And so I'm going to show you some steps now, and hopefully you could recreate the same thing if you wanted. So the first thing we're going to do is prepare the model as normal, remove everything from the sprues, clean up any mold lines with a mold line remover, and then generally tidy it up with a scalpel or hobby knife. Once everything is glued together, we're ready to go. The next thing we're going to do then is add a little bit more detail to the model to give a bit more texture, to make it look a bit more organic. And we're going to do this by using bicarbonate of soda combined with PVA glue and water. You want roughly a 1:1:1 mix of these three. And the idea here is it's just going to add a little bit of depth, a little bit more realism, so you haven't got as many flat plastic surfaces, so you have more detail, and we don't have to work quite as hard later on to get some nice effects. So as you can see on the screen now, we've got roughly a 1:1:1 ratio, and you mix this all together until you have a nice paste consistency, something like this. To apply it to the model then, you don't need to be particularly careful at all. You can just slap it on. If you get anything in a place where you don't want it, you can just use some water to remove it by washing it off. And you're just going to apply this all over the model, especially on flat surfaces, which will give it a bit more depth, and on places where organic things would naturally build up. So in the corners, down by the base, places like that. You do want to avoid some of the little details though, so try to avoid the skull decorations and the fence posts, places like that, where you don't want to hide the detail. And when you're done, you should have something that looks like this. So once it's dry, it will look something like this, and the bicarbonate of soda will give you some lovely texture to work with later. Okay, the next part then is going to be to prime it. We're doing this outside, just with Chaos Black to begin with, making sure you hit every single detail. Turning it round, making sure you hit the bottom as well, until you have a nice even coat of primer. Once everything has been primed, we're then going to use grey Seer from a can to apply a zenith highlight. What I mean by zenith highlight is you're trying to recreate the effect of light hitting the surfaces from the top. So you're only trying to catch the surfaces that are facing upwards, and you're trying to avoid the recesses and the shadows. So by spraying just from the top, you catch the higher edges and the flat surfaces, and you leave the recesses dark. You want to rotate the scenery whilst you're doing this to make sure that you hit the top from multiple different angles to give a nice even effect. The end result will look something like this. As you can see, we've still got some nice shadows in the recesses, but the higher edges, the flat edges, are nice and white. The next step then is to dry brush everything in a white colour just to bring out those details. I'm using cold white from Vallejo here, but you could use any white paint, doesn't particularly matter which. I'm also using an old makeup brush here to apply it, but again any kind of dry brush would work well. You don't want very much paint on the brush, so I'm using the back of my hand here just to get rid of the excess, and then just lightly brush it over all of the scenery, picking out those details. You can see that where we added the bicarbonate of soda mix earlier, it gives a really nice effect and almost instantly makes it look a lot like stone with very little effort on our part. Just go around then, making sure you catch all of the edges all over the scenery, trying not to leave too many brush marks, and we have a good base to move forwards with. Now we're going to start with some colour. We're going to start with the metal areas, which we're going to paint with a rusty old orangey effect. And to do this I'm using two paints, Gryph-hound orange in the bottom there, and Gore Grunta fur on the top. They're both contrast paints and both of them give a really nice effect when thinned down. I'm not using the contrast medium here, I'm literally just using water, and I'm painting all of the metal areas, things like the gates, the fences like we're doing here, and some of the small details on the tombstones. I'm just applying a single thin coat over all of these areas. I'm mostly using the Gore Grunta fur for about 80% of these, and then in a few different places I'm using Gryph-hound orange just to add a little bit of contrast, a little bit of variety. You don't need to do anything particularly special here. What you will find is that it naturally pulls towards the bottom, and that's actually great because it gives us an imitation of a shade. And you just want to be fairly neat. Don't worry too much if you catch other areas, because we're going to tidy that up later. You can see that the bicarbonate effect gives a really nice effect on the rust here at the bottom, where the contrast paint pulls around the outside of the granules and leaves the higher bits just stained bright orange. Next we're going to paint the green areas. This is for the ground and to give the impression of moss. So I'm using Militarum green, another contrast paint here, and I'm just thinning it down. So you can see on the palette I've got pure Militarum green, and then at the top maybe a 1 to 3 mix of water and contrast paint. In some places then we're just going to use the contrast paint undiluted all along the bases, for example, and starting to come up onto the fence in places. You don't have to be too neat about this, you don't have to be too consistent. The nice thing about this is because it's meant to be the earth, it will be a bit varied, a bit random. So once you've applied some areas with the pure Militarum green, you can then go back in with the diluted version just to join it up with the rest of the model, to make it look like a cohesive whole. So on the bottom of the railings, on the bottom of the posts, you can apply the thin down mix just to give you a bit of a transition. You can then gently combine the two edges, so where you've got the mould coming up the pillars, you can soften that effect just by using a little bit of water. Okay, so the next step is to paint the flowers. I originally tried to do this with Drakenhof Nightshade, but the colour was a bit washed out. It wasn't quite the intense blue that I wanted. So I ended up using Guilliman blue, which is a glaze paint, which is what I'm using here. I think it's actually not produced by Games Workshop anymore, but you could get a very similar effect by using a blue contrast paint, for example, Ultramarine blue or Thalasar blue, something like that. So when you're applying this, you want to be a bit more careful than you have been with the previous steps. With the brown and with the green, it didn't matter too much if you went over, but with this you have to be a bit neater. The next step then is just to tidy up with white some of those areas where we may have spilled over with our previous steps. I said you didn't have to be too careful, and that allows you to go a bit faster, but now we're going to counteract this by going back in with just some white paint. Again, I'm using Vallejo white, cold white. And you're just going to be repainting the skulls where you may have accidentally got some of the previous paints in the wrong areas. So for example here, I'm just blocking back in this skull with white paint. You don't have to be particularly neat about it, you just need to get the majority of the skull white again. So here you can see again on the top I had the similar problem, so I'm just blocking those back in white to disguise where the orange caught it earlier. Same thing is being done on the back. The reason we're doing this is because in a second we're going to use contrast paint to paint the skulls, and if we don't repaint these little details in now so you get the overall solid shapes, it's not going to look as smooth. So for painting these skulls, I'm going to put two paints on the palette. I've got Agrax Earthshade and Seraphim Sepia, but to be honest I mostly use the sepia colour when I'm painting these. When I use the Agrax Earthshade, it's just for those skulls that are nearer the ground to give them a slightly more muddy look, but to be honest you don't necessarily need it. I have just applied the Seraphim Sepia on that skull, and I'm now going to go around and do the same thing on the others. You don't have to be neat with this at all. I'm using it slightly thinned, maybe with a tiny bit of water added, so it's not stock, but it doesn't matter too much with the dilution, because what we're going to do is once everything has been coated in the sepia, we're just going to use the end of our finger just to imitate a highlight by brushing off the sepia stain from the front of the skull. And it gives quite a nice effect really quickly. The next thing we're going to do then is just go around, see if there's any small details that we might want to pick out. You could use white at this stage to pick out some of the little bits of the flower if you wanted to give them a little highlight. Or, for example, I found these candles on this wall section, so I'm just using Firey orange from Vallejo and I'm painting them in. I'm then just giving them a highlight with a tiny bit of white on top, just to make them stand out. You could do the same thing then with skulls, picking out a few different edges, things that you want to draw attention to. Okay, the next part then is going to be painting the roofs of the houses. To do this, we're going to be using Collier green shade. And we're just going to apply this to the roof, letting the pre-shading, the zenithal highlighting that we did earlier, do the majority of the work. I'm not actually going to add any more paint. The paint that I've just put on that is enough for the entire roof panel. And the idea is you're going to really thin it down and let the zenith highlighting show through from underneath. Again, you can see those tiny areas where there's a few little bits of the bicarbonate of soda are being picked up, and the shade paint is pooling around them, picking them out and adding a bit of realism. Just be a little careful here that you don't catch the stonework when you're doing this step. The next step then is to weather and to age the roof a little bit because it looks a little fresh. I'm using Militarum green again for this, and I'm just applying it where the moss and dirt would accumulate over time. Once you've applied it initially, you can then just use water diluted down to disguise the transition. So for example, that's what I'm doing here now. I'm just using water to disguise that join where the green started. Once you've done that, you should have everything looking like this, and you're finished. So hopefully that was of some use to you and everything was easy enough to follow. As you can see, it looks good enough on the table to be playing with. We could always go back and add some more details later on if we wanted. A few more highlights, a few more bits of shading, a few more little details to add some realism. Maybe some plants, maybe some roots, maybe some tea leaves or other foliage to give it a bit more realism. But it's perfectly good as it is. Let me know if there's anything else you would like me to cover in a future video, and I will see if we could potentially do that. Thank you very much for watching.